All right, welcome everyone. Really thrilled to be hosting Barry Strauss today for our Authors at series in Mountain View. Barry is a professor of history and classics at Cornell University, and he's the author of 7 books on ancient history and military, and a naval historian and consultant. For the spring semester, he is a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. In his book, Masters of Command, Barry compares the way the 3 greatest generals in the ancient world, Alexander, Hannibal, and Caesar, waged war and draw lessons from their experiences that apply on and off the battlefield. Understanding where each of these 3 great but flawed commanders succeeded and failed can serve anyone who wants to think strategically or must demonstrate leadership. And with that, I'll turn it over to Barry. Welcome.
Thank you, Jessica, and thanks, everyone. It's really great to be here. And as Jessica said, I'm going to talk about leadership. You know, I often talk about leadership, and I'm always excited to see how passionate people are about the subject. I want to talk about what makes a great leader and how leaders inspire and motivate people to give their best. But I also want to talk about what kind of leaders we need today. And to get to that subject, I'm going to start with the past. I'm going to take a historical approach. Now, I know that Henry Ford famously said that history is bunk. And I also know that I'm going to be speaking about ancient history. So perhaps what I'm going to be doing today is double bunk. But I hope that I can persuade you that there are some things about the human condition that haven't changed and from which we can learn. I can tell you that my methodology as a historian is fairly traditional. I think my perspective is broad, but my methodology is traditional, and my approach to some extent is storytelling. My notion of leadership is looking at leadership as an art rather than a science, although there's certainly scientific approaches that one could take. And my intention is to raise some broad questions. So in looking at Alexander the Great, Hannibal, Julius Caesar, and today I'm going to add a 4th person who's very much part of the story. That's Cleopatra. So in looking at these leaders, I want to talk about what I call the paradox of leadership, or what I also call the problem of Alexander and the cup of water. And I'll explain what I mean by that. More generally, I think I want to ask the question, is it better to have a leader who is charismatic or caring? Is it better to have a leader who is strong or humble? And is it possible to have both? Can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we have a leader who is both charismatic and caring? Well, those are some of the questions I want to ask today. Now, if you think about these names, I'm sure you've heard of them before. On the face of it, it might seem absurd to suggest that they could be caring or humble. After all, folks like Alexander and Caesar are exhibit A of power and ego, and the blind spots that those qualities can create. These are certainly leaders who issued top-down orders. And yet, the closer we look at them, the more we see that they didn't simply issue commands. And they weren't simply top-down. These were leaders who led by example, who considered others in the group, and who also offered outstanding benefits. So let me say a little bit about each of them, just as an overview to begin with. So Alexander, whose dates are 359 to 323 BC, he is the king of Macedon, and he goes on to conquer an empire. He conquers the greatest empire that the world had known to date, and that was the Persian Empire. It stretched about 3,000 miles from the Mediterranean to South Asia, and it included perhaps about 20% of the people on Earth. Alexander conquered this empire, and he employed a series of disruptive paradigms. First, he won a naval war on land. And second, having conquered the empire, he then proceeded to attempt to create a new ruling class that would consist of intermarriage between Greeks and Macedonians on the one hand and Iranians on the other. It was something that neither group took to easily. And Alexander, whether this experiment would have succeeded or not, we don't know, because Alexander died young and he left behind a legacy of civil war and disruption. His new empire did not last. With Hannibal, we're going down into the next century. He's born in 247 BC, dies in 183. He is a Carthaginian who, from a base in a colonial empire in southern Spain, invades Italy. And he does so, again, another disruptive paradigm, by shocking his Roman opponents, by marching 900 miles overland from southern Spain, across the Pyrenees, southern France, the Rhone, and then the Alps, and drops down into northern Italy. He takes with him an army and 37 elephants, who he famously manages to get across the Alps in the snow, and then invade Italy. He then proceeds to hand the Romans the biggest military defeats that they had ever had, including one of the most lopsided victories in history, the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, in which Hannibal's army defeats an enemy army that's about twice the size of his, and in which he carries out one of the gold standards of tactical achievement on the battlefield, a double envelopment, something that's bedeviled people over the ages, or bewitched people over the ages. He and his army last in Italy for 15 years. He never has a mutiny, which is very unusual for ancient conditions. But he goes on to lose the war. In spite of his great victories, in the end, he is defeated, and his own country suffers the fate that he expected Rome to suffer. Third case is Julius Caesar. His dates are 100 to 44 BC. Caesar was a great conqueror. His goals were first to conquer an empire for the Republic, his soldiers, and himself, not necessarily in that order. And then to take on, he conquers an empire in Gaul, and then to take on the entire Roman ruling elite and to bend it to his will, which he proceeds to do. He too uses disruptive paradigms. He invades Italy against the entire Roman state with only 5,000 men behind him. And in his climactic Battle of Pharsalus in Greece in 48 BC, he manages to defeat cavalry by a very unusual infantry tactic, sending infantry to stop cavalry dead in their tracks. Well, after all these conquests, he lets success go to his head. And he is the victim of one of the most famous and greatest conspiracies in history, the conspiracy of the Ides of March. 60 Romans, including a majority of them Caesar's own supporters, turn on him. They stab him to death in the Senate House and bring down the curtain very dramatically on his most extraordinary career. Finally, Cleopatra. Cleopatra is queen of Egypt. Her dates were 69 to 30 BC, so she too died young. She was a descendant of one of Alexander's generals, a Macedonian, and she came from a ruling house that had been ruling Egypt for several centuries. She herself did not have the throne. The throne had gone to one of her brothers, and she managed to maneuver herself to be in a position to become the queen of Egypt, to defeat her brother who was on the throne militarily, and then he dies in battle, then to get rid of another brother, and indeed to get rid of her sister. She was quite ruthless, but she was a brilliant strategist, exceedingly charming, and she managed to get on her side, in turn, two of the strongest men in Rome. First, Julius Caesar, whose lover she became, and she bore a son who she claimed was Caesar's son. And then Mark Antony. After Caesar is assassinated, she becomes his mistress and then his wife, and bears 3 children to him. She almost succeeds in having the power of Rome move eastward to the capital of Egypt, to Alexandria. And she almost succeeds in shifting the balance of power, in making Egypt independent, in bringing Rome over to Egypt. And she influences both Caesar and Antony and their conceptions. Huge influence on Caesar and on his notion of what it means, what he's going to do. Having conquered Rome, how is he going to govern Rome? And what is he going to do with the city of Rome? He gets a lot of his ideas from Cleopatra, from seeing her success as a queen and seeing what her dynasty had achieved in Alexandria as the capital city of Egypt. Antony also looks eastward, with Cleopatra opening a vision of conquest and empire in the east for him. In the end, it doesn't work. They come up against a greater talent, Octavian, who becomes Augustus, Rome's first emperor. But for a moment, it looks as if Cleopatra was going to be the most powerful woman in human history to that date. Okay, with that as a historical overview, let me say a little bit about my model of leadership and the paradox of leadership. So, on the one hand, we have very strong leaders. And these leaders all have in common a certain series of characteristics that they project. They project strength, they project intelligence, they project passion, energy, and communication skills. And in particular, each of them has a very powerful brand, a brand that's simple, identifiable, and compelling. They also have a persuasive mission. So it's the combination of the brand and the mission that makes their communication successful. Now, all of these qualities are ones that they could use by leading from the top. They're all top-down qualities. But there's another set of qualities that they have that are not so top-down. And these are leading by example, sharing hardships, minimizing risk to their best performers, building community, and offering outstanding benefits. These are all part of what these leaders did as well. So let's take a closer look at how this works. Okay, Alexander the Great first. Here is an image of Alexander. This is a Roman mosaic, a famous mosaic that comes from Pompeii. And it projects Alexander as he wanted people to see him. You can see that he is in battle. He's in battle against his Persian opponent. He is on horseback. If you look at the guy behind him, you'll see that the fellow behind him is wearing a helmet, which of course Alexander would have been doing as well in battle. He wouldn't have gone into battle without a helmet. But the artist is taking license here that's very much part of Alexander's public image, of someone who is fearless. He's someone who is young. Mature Greek men wore beards, but he is beardless, so he's emphasizing his youth. And you'll also notice his hair is parted in the middle, and it is swept back. It's windblown. This is the image that Alexander liked to present. Now, yes, here he is in a leadership role, going fearlessly into battle. But he's also somebody who saw himself very much as a caring leader and someone who paid attention to his men. This is the story of Alexander and the cup of water. At one point during his long journey eastward, conquering the Persian Empire, he found himself in what is today Afghanistan. And Alexander was leading his army northwards through the desert in what is today northern Afghanistan. It's an area of desert. The men were running out of water. They were in terrible shape. And let me read to you from one of the ancient sources what Alexander does. These urgent problems distressed Alexander. His friends stood around him and begged him to remember that his intrepid spirit was all that could restore the fortunes of his languishing army. At this point, he was met by 2 of the men who'd gone ahead to select a campsite. They're carrying skins of water to bring relief to their sons who they knew were suffering from severe thirst in Alexander's column. On meeting the king, one of them opened a skin, filled the cup he was carrying, and offered it to him. Alexander took it. Then he asked for whom they were carrying the water and learned it was for their sons. He returned the cup as full it was when it was offered to him, saying, I cannot bear to drink alone, and it is not possible for me to share so little with everybody. Go quickly and give your sons what you have brought on their account. So after this gesture, this of self-abnegation, that very evening they come to a river, they can all drink, and Alexander waits until everyone in his army drinks. He's the last one to take a drink of water. Did it really happen this way? Doesn't matter. It's the message that Alexander gave out. It's the image that he wanted to have people to have of him. As I said, a caring leader. Here's another image of Alexander. This is a coin issued in his lifetime. You can see Alexander's head here, and he is wearing the lion skin of Heracles or Hercules. He identifies himself with this great Greek hero, this great Greek warrior, a symbol of strength, but also the son of Zeus, the king of the gods. We see Zeus on the other side of the coin. You can see that it says the coin belongs to Alexander. And Alexander proclaimed himself as the son of Zeus. He proclaimed himself as no less than a god. This outraged some of his subjects, but delighted others, because for them, being the son of the god was in some ways equivalent to us being a celebrity, being somebody who really deserved great fame. Now, there are other ways as well in which Alexander showed that he was caring. He visited the sick in military hospitals. He took very good care of widows and orphans. He set up statues back in the home country to officers who had died in battle. And he certainly led by example. More than any of the other people we're talking about, he liked to lead in the front lines. In fact, he fought in the front lines too much. During his battles, Alexander suffered 7 major battle wounds, one of which almost killed him. And it might be the reason why he succumbed just before his 33rd birthday to a virus. If he hadn't had these series of wounds beforehand, he might have been in better shape. He was a workaholic, and he said that only the need for sleep and sex reminded him that he was human. Well, he was human, and as I said, he died at the age of 33 while he was planning to lead his army on to yet more conquests. Having conquered the Persian Empire, he intended to conquer Arabia, then Carthage, and then Italy. Okay, so let's move on to Hannibal. We don't have a coin of Hannibal, at least one that we can securely identify as belonging to Hannibal. This coin was probably issued by his father, Hamilcar, who was also a great commander, but it touches the same themes that Hannibal touches in his propaganda, and we know that Hannibal uses these themes because the written sources talk about them. So on one side of the coin, the face we're looking at is by now our old friend Hercules. He's got a victory wreath, and he is carrying a club, another symbol of Hercules. Hercules is important for Hannibal because he's also the first god of the ancient world to go to Spain, to go from the eastern Mediterranean all the way to Spain. Hannibal has his base in Spain. Hannibal's a Carthaginian. They worship Hercules in their own form. They call him Melkart, but it's roughly the same god. They have a temple of Hercules that they build on the Atlantic Ocean because they're so excited about the fact that they're so intrepid, they've gone all the way from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. And according to myth, Hercules, after going to Spain, goes back towards Greece by way of Italy and has some conquests in Italy as well. So he's a symbol of Hannibal and how Hannibal plans to conquer Italy. He's Hannibal's brand, if as it were. If Alexander's brand was youth and charisma, Hannibal's brand is Hercules and the elephant. And here you see the elephant on the other side of the coin. Now, why the elephant? The Carthaginians acquired elephants in Africa and brought them with them to Spain and then indeed to Italy. But the paradox, and they used them in war, but the paradox is that they didn't use them very much. The elephants were more terror weapons than anything else. They were more symbols than they were practical realities in battle. In fact, elephants are of so little use in battle that one of my colleagues says there's a simple rule to ancient battle: the side that has the most elephants always loses. But the elephant was a really good symbol for Hannibal. The elephant is a symbol of strength, of heroism, of intelligence, because elephants are very intelligent animals, of emotion, because elephants are easily aroused to emotion, and of rebellion, because elephants are hard to control. And it's a symbol that Hannibal goes back to again and again. He makes sure that he's seen riding on elephants in the Italian countryside. He makes sure that he's seen entering elephants when he enters cities. And even though he's very short on supplies in Italy, he has his home base in Carthage send 9 elephants across the Mediterranean. It's so important to him that he has these to intimidate the opposition. Now, if Alexander's mission was a mission of revenge and conquest, Hannibal's mission is a mission of revenge and liberation. When he comes to Italy, he says he is not there to conquer the Italians, but rather to liberate the Italians from the yoke of Rome. Italy for the Italians is his motto. And he uses it again and again to try to wean away allies from Rome and wean them over to the side of the Carthaginians. And he offers these allies extremely generous terms in order to get their support. He's successful to a degree, though not ultimately to the degree that would allow him to win. He depends above all on the army he's brought with him and on the reinforcements he gets. It's a remarkable army. It is one of the most multi-ethnic armies in the ancient world. It is surely the most multi-ethnic professional army that the ancient world has seen. It consists of people from North Africa, both Carthaginians, Libyans, and people of Berber descent, as well as Numidians, that is to say, the equivalent of Algerians today. It consists of people from Spain, mostly Celt Iberians. It consists of Celts from northern Italy, and it consists of Greeks and Samnites and Oscan speakers, a variety of people from southern Italy, all of whom join Hannibal. How does he hold them together? Well, one of the ways that he holds them together is through his ability to lead by example. Let me read a quotation. "There was no leader in whom the soldiers placed more confidence or under whom they showed more daring. He was fearless in exposing himself to danger and perfectly self-possessed in its presence. No amount of exertion could cause him either bodily or mental fatigue. He was equally indifferent to heat and cold. His eating and drinking were measured by the needs of nature, not by appetite. His hours of sleep were not determined by day or night. Whatever time was not taken up with active duties was given to sleep and rest, but that rest was not wooed on a soft couch or in silence. Men often saw him lying on the ground amongst the sentinels and outposts, wrapped in his military cloak. His dress was in no way superior to that of his comrades. What did make him conspicuous were his arms and horses. He was by far the foremost both of the cavalry and the infantry, the first to enter the fight and the last to leave the field." So he was indeed someone who led by example. He's also someone who takes great care to minimize the risks that his best men share. So his best soldiers, the elite ones from North Africa, he is very sparing of. and only uses them in the most necessary situations, otherwise using other soldiers. He himself, like Alexander, shares hardships and suffers with the men. While he is leading the army over the mountains from northern to central Italy, they have to go through a very difficult swamp. It's extremely unhealthy. He gets an infection in his eye, and the infection leads to permanent negative effects. He loses sight in one of his eyes. He's willing to take this kind of risk and suffer this kind of loss for the cause. Has a great effect on his followers, particularly the Celts, because the Celts believed that one of their gods was a one-eyed god. And they came to associate Hannibal with this one-eyed god and saw him, like that god, as someone who was leading to victory. Hannibal also has a sense of humor. We're told that before the Battle of Cannae, when one of his officers saw that the Romans outnumbered them by 2-1, he said he was terrified at the amazing army that the Romans had put together. The man's name was Gisgo. So Gisgo was terrified at how amazing the army was, and Hannibal replies to him, "It is an amazing army, Gisgo, but I'll tell you one thing I'm sure of. There's no one in it named Gisgo." As I said, Hannibal never suffers a mutiny. Alexander does suffer a mutiny. His men mutiny in India and force him to turn back. Hannibal is in Italy for 15 years, living off the land, and yet his men remain satisfied. He pays them very well, and he also makes sure that they have sufficient rest and recreation. Let's turn to Gaius Julius Caesar. Here we see a statue of Caesar. This is a statue in green slate. It probably comes from Egypt. Probably was carved within the century after Caesar's death. If you look at it, you can see this is a statue that shows what a lot of hard living this man has done. His cheeks are sunken. He's got crow's feet. He's got wrinkles. His hairline is receding. His look is certainly not youthful and happy. This is probably the reality of the man in the last years of his life. We know that he was suffering from epilepsy as well as from a series of mini strokes, so hardly in the peak of health. But that's not the image that Caesar wanted to present to the Romans. Here we have a coin that was issued within a month before his death. So Caesar dies on March 15th, 44 BC. This coin probably was issued in February. And if you look at it, you see this man looks vigorous. He's looking straight ahead. He is square-jawed. He's wearing a victory wreath. There's nothing of the tired old Caesar that we saw before. And the legend is Caesar Imperator, Caesar the victorious general. This is one of the images he wanted the Romans to conceive of himself. Caesar's brand is victory, but not just any victory. It's victory won by intelligence and speed. And he comes up with one of the most famous marketing slogans in history. Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. He displays it in a triumphal procession through the heart of Rome, which is why I show this modern monument, the wedding cake as it's sometimes called, the altar of the fatherland in Italian. You see the chariot there on top, and this monument stands on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, which is where Caesar's triumphal procession would have ended up. I came, I saw, I conquered. It's meant to be so brief as to symbolize the speed of Caesar's victory. So Caesar was fighting a rebel in what is today Turkey. The father of this rebel had been one of the most problematic enemies the Romans had ever fought, and it took them 2 decades to defeat him. Caesar defeats this guy in 1 day. And that's what he wants everybody to remember. I came, I saw, I conquered. And indeed, his speed had been one of his trademarks throughout his military careers. He wants to terrify people into accepting his power. The funny thing about it is that in addition to being a general, Caesar is also a politician. And as a politician, he is the ancient equivalent of a populist. Not entirely a populist. He's certainly not a man of the people. As one of my colleagues put it, Caesar neither was nor is lovable. He was very much an aristocrat. And yet, he built his political career on giving benefits to the ordinary people of Rome, of listening to the ordinary people of Rome and speaking to their needs. So in that sense, he very much was a populist, as well as being someone who moved with great speed. There are other aspects in which Caesar showed his care for ordinary people besides his populism. As a commander, he paid great attention to the captains in his army. The senior officers of the Roman army were mostly there because they were aristocrats, they were nobles, and they got these positions from pull. The only reliable professional officers in the Roman army were the captains, or the centurions, as the Romans called them. These were people who came from the middle class or the upper middle class. And Caesar paid them a great deal of attention. Unlike other Roman generals, he listened to the centurions and what they had to say. He welcomed them to his councils of war. He gave them a seat at the table. When Caesar writes his famous propaganda books about his wars, the commentaries on the Gallic Wars and the commentaries on the Civil War, he foregrounds the centurions. In some ways, they're the heroes of the show. And they show how much they think of Caesar by later on offering him a loan when he's very hard up for funds. Another way in which Caesar shows his concern for ordinary soldiers is he honors them by calling them fellow soldiers. It may seem a small thing, fellow soldiers, but no Roman general had ever done that before. They'd always called them soldiers. He calls them fellow soldiers, as if he were one of them. And he certainly rewards them financially. He offers them enormous riches. An ordinary legionary, an ordinary soldier, would get a bonus that was 2,500% of his annual wages. A captain would get a bonus that's 5,000% of his annual wages. A colonel would get a bonus that was 10,000% of his annual wages. And as for the highest officers, their benefits were entirely off the charts. It's that sort of benefit that encouraged people to stay with Caesar for a long time. Again, if he's not a man who was naturally lovable, he yet was able to inspire friendship, sometimes by little gestures. For instance, once on campaign, one of Caesar's friends was in very poor health. They came to a place to spend the night. It was a small house, really a hut with a front porch. And Caesar insisted that his friend stay inside the house because he wasn't doing well, whereas Caesar slept on the front porch. After his assassination, one of Caesar's friends wrote in a letter, "I didn't follow the cause in supporting Caesar. I didn't follow the cause, I followed the man. And I followed him because he was my friend." So Caesar was able to inspire loyalty. Caesar also did a very good job in building a military culture that inspired and rewarded individual initiative. It might seem paradoxical that someone like Caesar, who became a dictator after all, Rome's first and only dictator for life, that someone like that should inspire individual initiative, and yet he did. I want to read to you a short selection from his commentaries on the Gallic Wars. This is from a battle at the beginning of the war, battle in what's now northeastern France, when the Gauls suddenly ambushed the Romans, and they threatened to conquer the Romans who are unprepared for them. And Caesar tells the story, typical Caesar style. He foregrounds his own contribution, and yet, as we'll see, more complicated than that. He says, "I had to do everything at once. Hoist the flag that was the signal for running to arms, sound the trumpet, recall the men from their work on the fortifications, bring back the men who had gone further afield in search of material for the rampart, get the troops into battle formation, address the men, give the signal for attack. There was no time to do most of these things, because the enemy was almost on us. But in this very difficult situation, two things helped us. First, the knowledge and experience of the soldiers. Their training in earlier battles meant that they could decide for themselves what had to be done without waiting to be told. Second, the order I had given to all the legionary commanders that they must stay with their legions and not leave the work until the fortification of our camp was completed. Because the enemy was so close and advancing at such speed, the commanders of the legions did not wait for further orders from me, but did what seemed best on their own initiative. Now, if Caesar, after he had conquered Rome, if Caesar had remembered to consult ordinary people, and if Caesar had remembered his background in associating with others outside of his class and not simply looking at himself, he might have avoided his fate of being assassinated. But he did not. And fairly or unfairly, the Romans blamed Caesar's fate in part on this person, who will be the last person we'll look at today, and that is Cleopatra. Now, Cleopatra was queen of Egypt, but she was also the mistress of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar had a very active extracurricular life, but none was more famous of his various loves than Cleopatra. Here we see two busts of them in Berlin. And if we look more closely at the bust of Cleopatra, this is one of the images that she presented of herself. It's actually quite important because it makes her look like a Greek woman or a Roman woman. It's kind of a standard image of the time. But her hairstyle is very striking. If you notice, her hair is pulled back in a bun at the nape of her neck, and in the front she has ringlets on her forehead. This is a style that swept Rome. It became one of the most popular hairstyles of the day. So much so that, as I said, she becomes an enemy of Octavian, so much so that Octavian's sister and his wife developed their own counter hairstyle to oppose to Cleopatra's. She's also wearing the ribbon of royalty. You can see it around her head. The ancients wore ribbons rather than crowns. She looks like a very serious person. She's attractive, but perhaps not beautiful. Here's another image of Cleopatra. This is a coin image. The hairstyle is similar, and she is wearing the ribbon of royalty. But in this image, she's projecting an image that is certainly not one of conventional beauty. In fact, as you can see, she's got kind of a prominent nose and also a very prominent chin. And on her neck, she might have a goiter, the site of a thyroid condition. She certainly could have presented herself more attractively if she had wanted. Why did she do it this way? Possibly because this is what she really looked like, and she wanted people to recognize her, but possibly because she wanted to recall images of her father, who had been king of Egypt, and she wanted to say, in effect, I am my father's daughter. Although it is not usual for the ruler of Egypt to be a woman, I'm entirely up to the job and no less capable than any man. Now, as I said, Cleopatra was extremely intelligent and capable of doing things differently. She is the first and only ruler of Egypt that we know of, first and only Greek ruler of Egypt who spoke Egyptian. She's the only one to do so. She certainly wasn't the first who knew how important it was to appeal to her Egyptian subjects, but she went the extra step. And I want to symbolize that in this slide. This is also an image of Cleopatra. Cleopatra, this is the temple of Dendera on the wall of the temple, and here she is with her son. And as you can see, Cleopatra shows herself as very much an Egyptian woman. She's not Greek, she's not Roman, she is Egyptian. appealing to her Egyptian subjects and in a traditional Egyptian pose. This might have come from the Pharaonic period. And she's with her son. Now, this is not an accident. Her son is co-ruler with her as Ptolemy the 15th. It's known as that's a typical name of the males of the dynasty. But he also has a nickname, and his nickname is Caesarion, which means Little Caesar, because she claimed that he was Caesar's natural child. Now, for her to present herself with her son, I think, is a strategy that's not uncommon for women leaders in the ancient world. Certainly in the Roman and the Egyptian world, it's very difficult for a woman to exercise power on her own without having at least symbols of male authority who she can work with. Very common in the Roman Empire, for instance. There are a series of quite powerful women, but they almost always work through a man and ideally through their son. In fact, there's a great unwritten book on Roman mothers and their sons. Certainly, there's work been done on Roman mothers, but I think there's more to appreciate just how close the tie, the mother-son tie, was in the Roman world, and how important it was to power. Caesar himself had a mother of whom we know little. Her name is Aurelia Cotta, but she was a byword for the Romans of a mother who had raised her son well and had succeeded in his education. It's not at all surprising that Cleopatra presents herself in this way with her son as a way of making her subjects see her as someone of great authority and someone who buttresses herself with her son's image. Cleopatra, alas, is also not successful in the end. Her attempt to work with Antony to defeat their enemies in Rome fails. They're defeated at the naval battle of Actium, and she and Antony each have to commit suicide, romantically but tragically for their point of view. So let me sum up what I have to say about these leaders. What are the lessons that we've learned, and what can the takeaways be? Well, I want to go back to the point that I mentioned earlier. It's possible to have leaders who are both charismatic and caring. It's possible to have leaders who are strong but humble. And I would suggest that with Alexander, Hannibal, and Caesar, and with Cleopatra, we have just this. They're strong, they're intelligent, they're personable, they're passionate, they're energetic, they are communicators who have simple, identifiable, compelling brands and persuasive messages. And yet, they also lead by example. They share hardships. They minimize the risks of their best people. They build a sense of community and individual initiative. And finally, they offer outstanding benefits. I hope those are the lessons that you'll take away from this look at these great leaders of the ancient world. Thank you.
Question for you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that a lot of the leaders had really innovative, disruptive paradigms
Yes.
and approaches to their strategy.
Yes.
What lessons can we take away from any common qualities that allowed for them to be so innovative and yet so seemingly in touch with their people?
Yeah, that's really a great question. I guess my first answer is probably one that maybe I shouldn't think of as a teacher, but not listening to their teachers. Alexander was famously taught by Aristotle, the philosopher, and I think he learned from Aristotle how to think, but also not necessarily reach the conclusions that Aristotle wanted him to reach. Aristotle was a great thinker, but Aristotle was quite an ethnic chauvinist who believed in the superiority of Greek civilization over any other civilization. He believed that Greeks were fit to be free men and people who lived in Western Asia were fit to be slaves. Alexander didn't reach that conclusion at all. In fact, he wanted to create a new ruling group that mixed Greeks with Iranians. So Aristotle wouldn't have been pleased with that. So one thing that they share is when you go to school, learn how to think, but not necessarily what to think. And maybe that's one lesson that we always should be taking away, looking for the broader lessons, looking for the paradigms rather than the content.
Great. Looks like we have a question from the audience.
Hi, thanks for an interesting talk.
You're welcome.
I think I'd like to work with Hannibal. He's the most interesting. One of the leaders around Silicon Valley that's fairly well known is Steve Jobs. Could you briefly compare his leadership style with that of the ancients?
Well, thanks for that question. Steve Jobs has sometimes been compared to Caesar, certainly in his desire to build something very big and also, I suppose, in the sense that he wasn't worried about who he might offend. He certainly wasn't shy about saying what he thought. Also, like any of these commanders, I hope I haven't left you with the idea that these commanders were nice folks, because they were ruthless. And Steve Jobs was certainly ruthless. But I think all three of them, what they share with Steve Jobs is there's a visionary quality to what they did. I think that Caesar in particular understood that the Roman Republic was simply incapable of dealing with the Roman Empire. The Romans had conquered maybe 50 million people at this point in history. And yet the defenders of the Republic thought that a few hundred families descended from the Roman nobility could go on governing 50 million people around the Mediterranean world without sharing power in any meaningful way with this wider group. I think Caesar understood that that was not acceptable and that they really needed to shift the paradigm in massive ways. It's one of the reasons why he was so controversial, and it's one of the reasons why he gets killed, because people don't want to share power. Likewise, Caesar was ahead of his time, perhaps not in such a good way, in that he believed that monarchy was really the only way to run Rome, and that the Republic, which was kind of ruled by committee, was not something that can continue. Steve Jobs clearly is also a visionary person, and like Caesar, I think he saw that people he saw something that people needed before they knew they needed it. They shared that in common. But you asked about Hannibal. So a way in which Steve Jobs is similar to Hannibal is they both saw themselves as liberators. You know, they both saw themselves who were freeing people and who were going to create a better world in that sense. Hannibal really didn't want to destroy Rome. He had no intention of burning Rome to the ground. He wanted the Romans to simply agree to give up their power and admit the fact that they were beat and that he had defeated them. So he wanted to, he was not a destroyer. He saw himself as a builder. So maybe in that sense, something in common with Steve Jobs as well.
Question for you on the brand that
Yes.
seems so strong for all of them.
Yes.
So this is obviously a time before there was widespread internet technology.
Right.
And a couple of the ways that you highlighted they spread their personal brand was through coins
Yes.
and public artwork.
Yes.
Were there other techniques they employed to get the word out and recruit people to their armies?
Yes. So great question. Caesar, again, is a really good example of this because he writes these books, the first campaign books, if you will, the commentaries on the Gallic Wars and commentary on the Civil War. And these books are written as annual reports that he sends home to Rome, and they are read by people in public. And they are ways to give certain messages. One, that Caesar is really doing great things for the Roman people. Two, that Caesar is a friend of the Roman people. And three, that you don't want to mess with Caesar. These are the messages that he's sending home in that way. Another way in which people communicated their message was through religion. Religion was very important for all of them. Hannibal associating himself with Hercules before he goes on his mission of conquest. He goes to that temple of Hercules on the Atlantic Ocean, and he lets it be known that he's in touch with Hercules himself before he goes on that mission. He also has visions, and he lets people know about his dreams and visions everywhere he goes. So that is another way to get the message out.
So some of the companies, that we see more and more in the modern era have a somewhat less hierarchical structure, especially in Silicon Valley, and are much considered more flat, where anyone can take and should take leadership initiative. What comparisons would you draw between the cultures that they tried to intentionally create? Were they more or less hierarchical? Did it depend on the leader?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a long, long way from these armies to Silicon Valley. But the one way in which I think there is something similar, particularly again with Caesar, is the attempt to reach outside of the narrow circles of the senior officers to find out what should be done. It was really very unusual for the commanding officer to say, I want to take these captains and I want them to be in the meeting when we decide what to do. That really is very unusual. And then to write books in which he advertises to people that he's talking to the captains. Again, that is a very unusual thing to do. Caesar's own style was not particularly approachable or personable. But in practice, in his own way, he was reaching out to a much wider group of people. Likewise, Caesar, in terms of his advisors, he's reaching out outside of the usual circle of the Roman nobility. He's consulting foreigners, and he brings them into his inner circle, or people who were foreigners who'd been given the Roman citizenship, because Romans did that. And he makes them some of his chief advisors. This is shocking to traditionalists, but it is a way in which he's flattening his organization just a little bit. Alexander also is reaching out to foreigners. He's horrifying traditionalists from Macedon who are saying, hey, we thought that we were going to be the rulers. What does this mean that you are talking to people who we've conquered? And Alexander marries women among the conquered people. And that's also a way in which he's reaching out and shocking and horrifying his followers.
Sounds like they were disruptive for their time.
They were definitely disruptive for their time.
One last question then. You mentioned that, they had obviously their qualities that allowed them to inspire followership and be great leaders and have very impressive victories and conquests in multi-ethnic armies. Talk a little bit about the lessons that we can derive from blind spots and when the victory sort of goes to the head. How do you avoid that as a leader?
Yeah. Well, the Romans had a custom. When a leader would win a great victory, he would march in a triumphal procession through the streets of Rome in a chariot, and there would always be someone behind him whose job it was to say to him, remember to die. Remember you're a mortal. So I think that one of the things that that a leader really needs is people who can say that to him. Trustworthy people who can say, you're not as great as you think you are. And that's a really difficult thing to do. I'd say that each of these leaders, one way in which they failed is they all had troubled relationships with their number two. None of them had a number two. None of them had a really good relationship with a number two. And often that is the thing that will save leaders, to have someone who trustworthy who can tell them that very thing. I think that's one of the problems they had.
Yeah. Very fascinating. Thank you so much.
You're
Please join me in thanking Barry Strauss for being here with us today, and hopefully we can all take away some interesting food for thought for the rest of our day here as we go about our day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.